Hello, all. My name is Natasha Halliday. So I'm here today to talk about fostering resilience in children and adolescents. I am a registered social worker, so that's what we call it in Canada. I understand you call it licensed social worker in the US. I have been working with children and youth for over 20 years and really just have a passionate passion for looking at how do we help children cope with the rough things in life because we know that we cannot avoid it. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that. So I'm going to talk today about fostering resilience in our children. So I'm going to look at what resilience is, how to recognize the resilience that your children already demonstrate, because resilience isn't a black or white thing where we either have it or we don't. Resilience is something that we have at different levels, at different times, and different amounts depending on what the situation is. We're going to look at some of the barriers to resilience, so some of the things that can get in the way, and learn to develop, further develop and foster resilient habits and mindsets and skills in our children. So, what is resilience? Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly, to recover well, and to really recover from the adverse situations that we face. If you think about it as something physical, if you think about an elastic band, resilience is like when we've been stretched, the ability to return back to shape. Now, sometimes we want to look at also how can we grow through adversity? And growing through adversity is things like, when Hurricane Katrina happened, there were infrastructure things developed that put the city in a better position to be able to deal with other types of natural disasters. So the outcome of such an awful event was that they had better systems in place going forward. So that's what growing through adversity looks like. And that's also part of resilience. And why is it so important? That might seem a bit obvious, but let's talk about why it's so important to have resilience. Well, one of the reasons it's so important to have resilience is because we cannot avoid difficult situations in life. They're going to come up. We are coming to the end of a global difficult situation, having been in the pandemic. And one thing that we've learned in the face of ongoing uncertainty is it was harder to cope when we were constantly being blindsided by what was new or ways that we were losing out. And when we have a resilient mindset and we have resilient strategies, we're able to adapt better to ongoing changes. So I like to look at resilience as a spectrum. When things happen that we find difficult, we start with just surviving, right? Think about the very beginning of the pandemic. We just did everything we were told. We were doing what we could to survive. We distanced ourselves. We were wearing our PPE, and all of that's necessary. And we didn't really necessarily do much else. The next phase of the resilience spectrum is moving into coping. So, developing strategies to deal with something that we find challenging. Now, sometimes we develop strategies that aren't that helpful as because it's a learning process. And so as we continue to learn about ways to deal with it well, we then move into thriving. And thriving is not just having those good coping and helpful coping strategies, but it's also having those new mindsets develop out of these situations that allow us to be able to move forward and to not be as negatively impacted as we might have originally been. So I want to give you an example. Think about a child being bullied at school. When the child is in survival mode, this is when they're going through the situation and just happening. They're showing up to school, these things are occurring. They're really just, being there in the situation with not much else to do. As they start to try to deal with it, like I said, sometimes our initial coping isn't something that's going to be helpful in the long term. So they might avoid school for a while, comply with bully demands if there's demands for things. Um, they might tell somebody, which is probably helpful, engage in self soothing behaviors, which can go either way. There's things they can do to comfort themselves that are helpful, and there's things that they can do to comfort themselves that in the immediate might feel good, but may not be helpful. And so coping, is an adaptive process where we start with whatever comes to mind first, and then we continue to build on it to look at the things that came to mind about making myself feel better how effective are they? And then we move into thriving, where we develop well and we start to flourish. And we engage in healthy coping strategies. So for this child at school, again, they're engaging in healthy coping strategies. The school avoidance is ended. They're able to return to the school. They're not negatively impacted. So maybe there might have been some anxiety or fears that started because of that process. When we move into thriving, we're able to not necessarily be impacted in that negative way and be affected by the things that come up, like the fears or the anxieties anymore. So we want to look at resilience as that spectrum. When that first catalyst of adversity hits, we immediately go into survival because that's what we're designed to do as human beings. We survive, we move into coping, both sometimes in ways that may not be long term helpful, and then we advance to the things that will be helpful, both in the immediate and in the long term, and then we move into thriving. So, again, looking at why resilience is important, one thing that I really want to stress is I feel that we live in a world that's trying to tell us we shouldn't experience pain and adversity, and we can't avoid it. So we do not want to teach children that you should not feel pain and you should not feel adversity. Because I'm a therapist, I see a lot of times my clients will tell me, I just don't want to feel anything bad, but then they end up feeling numb because they're trying to shut down all their feelings. And as human beings, we were developed with a wide array of emotions. So we don't want to mute our emotions. We want to learn to deal with them. And we want to learn to respond to adversity in a way that will help us thrive and grow through it. So part of that is based on how we think. And it's helpful to understand that resilience is a mindset. And preparing to be resilient, there's a visual that I like to give. And I used to talk about having an umbrella in the rain, but given we're coming out of this pandemic, I also want people to think about resilience being like our PPE, our our personal protective equipment, right? So we don these different things in order to be able to go into whatever it is that is less desirable, but not have that most probable negative impact hit us in that way. So, like I said, I've also used the umbrella in the rain. So, if you think about every raindrop that falls, like the adversities that come in our life, we cannot avoid rain. So, what do? We wear raincoats, we wear boots, we use umbrellas, we find ways to be in the rain, but not have that worst impact of maybe getting drenched or being soaked by what's happening. And that's exactly what resilience does. It allows you to go through these experiences, but really come out in a way that you're not as negatively impacted, or you start to recover from the negative impact that it was having. Resilience is really tied to our thoughts. Like I said, it's a mindset. And a lot of it's cultivated from within in terms of our thinking and how we react to stressors. So we're always interpreting the situations that we experience. And so when we're looking at children, we want to start to observe how they're interpreting and teach them to pay attention to how they're understanding what they're going through so that they're developing mindsets that are helpful to them. So, an example of resilient thinking: if things don't go according to the plan that I made, can I make another plan? And a resilient approach is looking for strengths and opportunities to build on rather than sometimes we get deficit and problem mind focused and we look at the things that need to be remedied or treated. So turning that around to look at what works here, what is working well, what can I build on rather than just focusing on what's not working is part of how we take a resilient approach to things. So I want you to imagine for a minute a child doing some artwork and it's paint everywhere. It's just, a mishmash of colors. It's off the table that they're doing, it's on their clothes. And think about if you as a parent walked into that. Are you immediately going to see a mess or are you able to see the potential making of a masterpiece? And the reason that I offer that visual is to think about a lot of a lot of what children learn is based on how we as adults respond. So we also have to be aware of what our thinking is and what our mindset is and how do we feed what they're thinking based on how we respond to things. So ideally, yes, it's messy, but can you see the making of a masterpiece? Because where we're going to respond differently potentially based on how we see it. So when we're looking at teaching children resilience, we want to accept them for who they are without realizing we walk through life with a lot of unspoken expectations. And so looking at what do I expect of my children, or if you're working in a school, the children that you work with, or in a daycare or whatever environment, what do you expect from the children and how can you make sure that your expectations don't supersede their abilities and who they are? So we want to nurture resilient mindset, and that requires us to really move through our interactions with them with unconditional love, with practicing non judgment, by giving them opportunities to problem solve. And I'll get more into that. So we want to, and in order to do this, we have to accept children for who they are, not who we want them to be. It's okay to help guide, but we don't want to override who they are intrinsically based on what we want. So it's really important to examine, as I said, your expectations. Ask yourself, are your expectations realistic? Are they capable of this? Are my expectations fair? Because we don't want to set expectations that go against who they might be as a person. I'll give you a personal example. When I was 7, I, like many little girls, wanted to be a ballerina. Go figure. What I didn't know was when I started ballet, my parents were like, that's a great idea. We're going to put you into ballet. What I didn't know was that I had a medical condition that was going to limit my ability to do ballet. Now, imagine having parents who are so focused on me being this ballerina that they were struggling to accept that physically this wasn't congruent with what was best for me. So we always want to pay attention to what are my hopes and desires and expectations as the adult, and am I imposing them on the child past the point that might be helpful? It's okay to encourage, it's okay to guide, but we really don't want our desires to take over. We want to keep in mind that when children are safe, they're more likely to be resilient. So we want to look for how to build safety into the lives of our children. Something else to keep in mind about building resilience in children, we don't want to accommodate every single wanted need. Children benefit from learning very early on that they cannot always get what they want. So mistakes and disappointments are a part of life. How we respond to them will eventually speak louder than the words we speak to children. So they're watching us. They're looking at how we respond. We're teaching them all the time about how to respond to things. Whenever we try to provide certainty and comfort, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we don't want to do it in a way that gets in the way of children being able to develop their own problem solving and mastery. We don't want to overprotect them in a way that might fuel anxiety. So you want to consider some balance in that. Obviously, you want to keep children safe. Obviously, you want to um, provide that safe, comforting environment. But allowing children some opportunity to make age appropriate and developmentally appropriate choices helps develop their confidence, which is a part of them building their resilience. Again, looking at the idea that we don't want to accommodate every single need, because when and understand why, when somebody learns that every need that they have will be met, they are more devastated by a need not being met. And eventually there will be a need that is likely not met. So if their every need and want is met, children don't learn that we sometimes might be disappointed and they won't know how to cope with that. You can teach them to do things on their own and start thinking bit by bit. We do this all the time. We teach them at a certain age to tie their shoelaces. First we start by choosing their clothes for whatever school, daycare, whatever. Eventually we start having them put some choice into that. So this is a natural part of the parenting process. And maybe we're not always thinking about what the benefit is, but that benefit is really about developing a bit of confidence and increasing it because one, you're saying to your child, I trust you to make some decisions, which will teach them to trust themselves to make decisions. But it also, decision making is a skill. It's like a muscle that needs to be developed. And I'll give you an example. I have my 17-year-old goddaughter does a lot of my business Instagram. Initially, she came to me for every image. Should I use this? Should I use this? What should I use? And a lot of times it was I was giving her. And so finally one day I thought, I want her to develop this more as a skill. And I asked her, could you provide me with an image that you think would be um, appropriate for this quote that we are posting? And funny enough, she came up with something that was almost exactly the same as the one that I picked. I said, we'll both put one in the chat because we were having a WhatsApp chat. And then I told her, okay, you know what? Like, I like yours better. I'd like you to use yours. After that incident, she never asked me again what image to select in the pattern where there's an image that goes with the quote, with the way that my Instagram is formed. And it's that developing that confidence that helps them build. And I know that I saw that in her, and that's definitely what happens with children is we want to teach them how to develop their confidence and start making decisions. So we don't want to remove all risk. I'm sure by now you've heard terms like helicopter parenting and snowplow parenting, where we remove all obstacles. But if we remove all obstacles again, the expectation becomes that life doesn't present with obstacles. But guess what? Mom, dad, auntie, uncle are not going to be present in every situation in life, removing all obstacles. And so it's important for children to start to learn. This is part of them building this resilience, is that there will be some potential risk. There will be some potential things to consider because that starts to teach them how, making them think about it is the first step in looking at how do I then deal with it. And of course, naturally, we want to keep our kids safe, right? But again, eliminating all risk robs children of learning resiliency. So we know that we learn from mistakes, and we want to start teaching children bit by bit to learn from mistakes, right? Also, we also want to think about how do we start to help them learn from natural consequences, right? So an example of this might be something like, if you have a child that plays a sport, if they want to skip practice and then the next time for the game, they're not placed in the game, that might be a natural consequence. That gives them the opportunity to evaluate. You can ask them, what do you think happened why you weren't in the game? And give them the ability to start thinking about, well, because I wasn't at the last practice, I missed maybe some of the plays, whatever it might be. And so I wasn't ready. And I think that's why my coach kept me out of the game. So it's really important to look at how do we give kids an opportunity to start thinking about when there's something that happens, there's a consequence, and how to make choices that will lead to the type of outcomes that they want. Kids are going to make mistakes. All of us adults make mistakes. We all do. So let them make mistakes. We don't want to make them feel like there's mistake means that you're a failure, right? And truthfully, failure is not the end of the world. So even deconstructing that negative meaning that failure is often held, right? It's a place where you get an opportunity to figure out what to do next. So letting them mess up a little bit might be tough and painful for you as a parent, but it also gives an opportunity for them to start developing these skills that they need to take into adulthood. And we always want to remember that what's happening in their childhood is preparing them for later parts of their life. So we want to be teaching them skills as they go. Check in with yourself. Are you an anxious parent? Do you have perfectionist tendencies? Do you help do your children's homework because it meets your own need to have things done right or to have things done a certain way, and makes you feel more at ease? So we really want to check in with how what's going on with ourselves contributes to how we interact with our children. And again, thinking about, but what's the outcome of this? What am I indirectly teaching? Because we're not just teaching with the words that we use. We're teaching with our behavior, we're teaching with our response, we're teaching with our words, because they're listening and they're paying more attention than we think. So we want to give a part of building resilience in children is, as I said, teaching them to problem solve. So we want to look for opportunities for them to problem solve. They're less likely to engage in power struggles when they feel a sense of empowerment. So giving them some choice might be helpful, right? Remember, I said earlier that we start by choosing their clothes and then eventually we allow them to choose clothes. That gives them a sense of agency, gives them that sense of empowerment. And they start to be able to anticipate some of the obstacles to the choices they make when they experience, when they see that there's setbacks and they start to learn from these situations. So, by contrast, when children have difficulty problem solving, they may be unable to articulate and define what they consider the problem or the issue to be. And this results in difficulty thinking of options, planning, and navigating the adverse things that they are facing. And remember, at a very young age, it might not seem like adversity to us, but adversity is also relative to the person experiencing it. So, at their young, tender ages, the things that they're experiencing that are difficult, we want to start to help them learn to be able to deal with those things as best they can. And also learn that there can be collaboration, right? How do I, with mom or dad, how do I, with this person, come up with something that I can do? So, obstacles to teaching children how to solve problems and make decisions. Believe if we believe that children don't have the ability to make decisions, and so that we have to do it for them, we hamper their ability to learn to make decisions. If we expect more from our children than they can deliver, by the opposite end, that in itself can create an issue. We want to allow children to make decisions as long as what and we sorry, let me correct that. We want to make sure that we're not allowing them only to make the decisions that line up with what we feel is best. So sometimes we got to make sure that we're taking ourselves a bit out of the equation to give them that ability to develop that agency and that start developing that strength within themselves. So there's some principles to reinforce for problem solving and decision making. Model problem solving skills. If something happens in your life and your child witnesses you have what's essentially the adult version of a tantrum, that's going to teach them that that's the response. So we want to be able to model the things that we want to see in them. We want to make sure that we're demonstrating in our own behavior. Provide choices at an early age and paying attention to what might an age appropriate choice be. Also, we want to look at, can we teach them to start to follow and understand that there's a bit of a sequence to solving problems. So first, we have the thing that we realize is what we're concerned with. So we have to define what we see as the problem. That's the first thing. Next, we want to start to think about, if I see this as a problem or an issue or a concern, what do I think can be done? Evaluating in your head before you even start to implement, what are some of the options? And it may not just be in your head. This can be done through dialogue. This is a dialogue children can have with adults, right? These are some of the things they learn in some of the sports they play or some of the games and activities they do at school. Starting to learn at, if this is my concern, what are some of the options to deal with it? Then they implement what they might determine is the best choice, and then evaluate, how did that work out? So we start by defining the problem, we evaluate what the responses are to that concern, we do something, we implement it, and then we spend some time checking and evaluating, how did we think that went. So this is the problem solving sequence that we want children to recognize is happening, and especially because we don't often check back, which is why we might repeat something that's less effective, right? And then it becomes a pattern and it's harder to break out of. So looking at, okay, how did that work out? If it did work out, what do we think we could do differently in the future? And teaching children early on that this is a way to address the concerns they have is a huge part of building their resilience, because it's a reminder that there's not a full stop one way to do it. If this didn't work out, there are likely more options. And hopefully that indirectly says then, when we face adversity, if things don't go as we want, we still have options to try to move things in the direction to where we want. Again, like I said, we want to try to teach them to problem solve. So I have a little bit of a scenario. So if your child tells you that they don't want to go to school because they got into an argument with a friend, you can talk to your child about the impact of missing school and avoiding dealing with the argument. And then you have an opportunity to gauge with your child and have them try to think about what are the ways that they think they can deal with it and figure out what works and what doesn't. And it's just, again, looking at what are the things that you're going to help your children do by you doing, but also by them doing so that they can start to develop these skills. You want to ask yourself what specific skills does your child need to learn in order to handle the situation? And then how do you help them foster that? Right? One of the ways we want to do that is by looking at we tend to often ask when something happens, maybe a child does something undesirable and we say why. Not necessarily an inappropriate question, but often then they start to search for ways to maybe blame themselves. So one of the things we can look at is we can also ask, how do you think that worked out? And if they say they don't think it worked out well, then we can ask, move to, okay, so how can we do this differently in the future so that this doesn't happen again? But paying attention to how our language becomes part of it. Another part of building resilience in children is helping them manage their emotions. So we don't want to teach them to avoid emotions. And we know there's certain emotions that we feel are bad or good, but all emotions are relevant as human beings. But teaching children how to handle emotions. So, yes, you might feel angry, but your response in your anger is what's more important than feeling the anger itself. It's, you might feel sad, and we don't want to feel sad, but your response in your sadness is more important than than feeling the sadness itself. And we don't want to negate the unhappy feelings that they have, but we really want to be able to teach them that there's ways to deal with it that can be more helpful rather than harmful. The last part that I just wanted to address in terms of building resiliency in children is, again, and I've touched on this already, modeling that resiliency. So kids learn from observing their parents. They are watching us way more than we think. So if we respond in a certain way that we wouldn't want them to respond, and we have to keep in mind that we're still teaching them that. So we want to know that we are even doing the work for ourselves to learn how to manage our emotions and looking at how we respond to something. So keep in mind, resiliency helps kids navigate the inevitable trials, triumphs, and tribulations of childhood and adolescence. Resilient children also become resilient adults and are able to survive and thrive in the face of life's unavoidable stressors. That's it for now. Thank you so much. I hope that you benefited from this and that you have a wonderful, wonderful day.